So today's daf is daf Yud Aleph, and we're about 10 lines down from the top. Ella li olam. So the line starts with the word Bay. And we're going back to Rava. We're going to revisit Rava. Rava, based on a brisa in Masechet Me'ilah on daf Chaf Aleph, tries to explain why Me'ilah is classified in our Mishnah as harim hatluyim b'sa'ara, meaning that there's nothing really much in Torah Shebechsav, and the thrust of what we know is about Torah Shebal Peh. And why does Me'ilah fit that category? After all, there's so much in the Torah at the beginning of Sefer Vayikra in the 5th chapter about Me'ilah. Why is that called harim hatluyim b'sa'ara? So Rava explained the following. If, let's say, I'm a balabayis and I have modes of Hegdesh, mistakenly, I replaced the modes of Hegdesh with mistakenly, I thought they were modes of Chulin, and I replaced them with modes of Hegdesh. I gave them to a Shliach, and I appointed him as my proxy to purchase, let's say, some garments in the local Macy's department store. And unbeknown to the Shliach, these were modes of Hegdesh. The Shliach went to the store and he purchased Hegdesh. He purchased a garment of Chulin, obviously, thinking that he was spending modes of Chulin. And in real terms, it was modes of Hegdesh. So there was a violation here of the Isur Me'ilah. And the Brisa establishes that who is chayav for Me'ilah? It all depends. If the Shliach fulfilled his shlichus and he did everything precisely according to the will and the instruction of the Mishalech, of the Balabayis, then the Balabayis is considered Moal Behegdish. And that's based on the principle of Shlucho Shal Adam Kimoso. So the Shliach is now the right arm, the extended arm of the Mishalech, and therefore the Mishalech is chayav for Me'ilah. If, on the other hand, the Shliach makes a boo-boo, and let's say, for example, instead of buying a garment, he buys food, that's called Mishana, that's called a Shinui, and once he makes a Shinui and he changes the will of the Mishalech, he is no longer operating as a Shliach. And in such a case, the Brisa establishes that the Shliach is chayav mishum Me'ilah. So Rava asked the following question: why is the Shliach chayav mishum Me'ilah? It doesn't seem to make any sense. He says the following, that the Shliach is under the misimpression that he is operating totally on behalf of the Balabayis. He doesn't realize that the Balabayis was so disappointed in the fact that he didn't buy the right object, that the Balabayis was mavatel shlichus, and by invalidating the Shliach is now chayav mishum Me'ilah. So the question that Rava wants to understand is, why is the Shliach chayav mishum Me'ilah in this case? After all, he thought he was fulfilling the will of the Balabayis, and he's the extended arm of the Balabayis. And this is what the Mishnah means by Me'ilah keharim hatluyim b'sa'ara, that this is all based on Torah Shebal Peh. And there's a special Kabbalah, a special transmission through the oral law that justifies the fact that the Shliach is chayav mishum Me'ilah. But we had a problem with Rava. What was that problem with Rava? Why should the Shliach be any different than, let's say, the classic case of Me'ilah, where the Balabayis thinks that he's buying something in the store with mos of Chulin, unbeknown to him, it's mos of Hegdesh, and he's chayav mishum Me'ilah. The same thing, applies to the case of the Shliach who thinks he's buying something on behalf of the Mishalech with mos of chulin, and unbeknown to him, it turns out that it's really most of hegdesh. He's chayav mishum me'ilah, simply because the Baal Bais would be chayav mishum me'ilah if he accidentally spent most of hegdesh, thinking that it was most of chulin. Gemara says no. Hasam made the yada de ikazuzi de hegdesh. In the classic scenario of me'ilah, the Baal Bais is aware of the fact that he has most of hegdesh in his possession. He mistakenly thinks that the most that he's using now to purchase something in the store are most of chulin, but at least he's aware of the fact that within his rishus he has most of hegdesh, and therefore he should have been very careful, checked out the most, and before he spent them, guarantee that these are in fact most of chulin. Imagine he has two kupos. He puts in one kupa most shel hegdesh and another kupa most shel chulin, and then he accidentally stretches his arm out to the kupa that contains most shel hegdesh, and he spends that money. Well, he is a shogeg. The word shogeg in this case means negligent. There's an element of negligence. Hey, buddy, you have two kupos. Before you go ahead and spend this money, which might be hegdesh, make sure that you're stretching your arm out to the kupa of chulin. But hacha, in the case of a shliach, mi yada, the shliach is totally unaware of the fact that the Baal Bais has a kupa of mochel hegdesh. As far as he's concerned, the total, shall we say, inventory of all the currency in the Baal Bais' possession are all chulin. He doesn't even have to raise the problem. He doesn't even have to enter into his mind that maybe the most that he's being given are accidentally most shel hegdesh. And therefore, why should the shliach be chayav mishum me'ilah? Where's the shogeg element? And I knew that's what our Mishnah means to classify me'ilah as harorim hatluyim b'sara. This is a halacha that was transmitted in Torah Shabbat Peh. There's nothing in the laws of me'ilah as recorded in the Torah itself that would justify putting a chiyuv me'ilah on the shoulders of the shliach. He has no clue that the Baal Bais has a kupa shel mos of hegdesh. Now we go on. The Mishnah says about Shabbos, the laws of Shabbos, the laws of Chagigos, the laws of Me'ilos, Mikra Muat, V'halachos Merubos. In the Torah Shabbat, there's a very limited section that's dedicated to these laws, and the halachos are very, very manifold and very complicated, nuanced halachos. Take, for example, Shabbos. The Torah says, Kol malach lo tas. That's it. And yet from that, we have Masechet Shabbos. I'm not sure if it's the largest Masechet Shabbos, but it's certainly up there, with nuances of dinim. And that's called Mikra Muat V'halachos Merubos. In the Mikra, it's very limited. Tana, we learned in the Brisa, Negoim Olos Mikra Muat V'halachos Merubos. The Brisa adds to the Mishnah. The Mishnah only has three categories of Mikra Muat V'halachos Merubos. It has Shabbos, Chagigah, and Me'ilah. And now the Brisa adds another two categories. Negoim, which is Saras, that the Kohen should recognize that that dermatological, pathological manifestation as tsaras, and olos, tumas oil, tumas mes. When a person is in the same oil as a corpse, he contracts tumah. And these are mikra muat, and once again, very limited in Torah Shebechsav. Same thing with regard to olos. So the Gemara immediately raises the objection. Negoim mikra buat, negoim mikra merubo. There are so many psukim that address negoim. Tons of psukim. An entire parsha of Mitzorah and much of Tazria. How can you possibly justify the Brise's assumption that negoim is mikra muat? It's not true. That's what the Bryce has in mind. Negoim mikra meruba. Halachos muatos, relative to all the nuances that are written in the Torah itself, inscribed in the many psukim and parshas of Negoim in the Torah, relative to the volume of psukim in the Torah itself, the halachos are muatos. There's not that much that we have to add in Torah Sheba'al Peh to the Torah Shebachsav, which is so extensive. Olos, mikra buot, v'halachos merubos. But olos, tumas oel, is the beginning of Parshas Chukas. Very limited discussion there about what tumas oel is all about. And it's halachos merubos. There are so many different branches of halachos with regard to tumas mes. For example, if you sit on top of a mess, if the mess is suspended on top of you, if you're both in the same oil, if the mess is in the oil and you put a leg into the oil and so forth, there's so many halachas merubos. So the Gemara says, "My nafkamina." Why does the Mishnah and the Brisa bother spending so much time classifying these halachas, these areas of halachas, either mikra muat, halachas merubos, halachos muatos, mikra? Well, what do we need that for? Well, it seems like it's totally irrelevant. And the Gemara says it's relevant for the following guidelines. The imis tapkana lach milsa. If, let's say, we get to a point where we don't know what the law is, then b'negoyim, if your suffix is in a goyim, the Mora Hora should be instructed that the first place to look for an answer to his unknown questions is Bikroi. Look at the psukim. Maybe you didn't learn the psukim thoroughly. There's so much there, a wealth of knowledge in the psukim, you'll find an answer to your question. If you stop going on Milsa Biolos, in contrast, you have a suffix about tumas mes, you're not going to find the answers in the Mikra. Ayin v'masnisen, take a look at the Mishnayos. The psukim of the Torah are very meager, very limited. You won't find the answer to your question. The Mishnah says dinim, which is dinim mominus, monetary law. They have al mashi yismachu midrashos hakos. In other words, you don't need a light allusion. There is massive amount of information in Parshas Mishpatim, detailed laws that are included in the verses in that parsha with regard to dinim mominos. However, although yesh lehem mashi yismachu, you have a basis in the Mikra, but your answers to your questions are not in the Mikra. They're not explicit in the Torah. The Chachamim, through Torah Sheba'al Peh, are going to interpret the laws and how they apply. So Gemara asks the following question. Are you telling me that there's no massive amount of psukim that address the laws of dinim mominos and Torah Shebachsav? Michtav Ksivan. Go through the entire Parshas Mishpatim. So many details are recorded by the Torah. Lo nitzracha el l'kid Rebbe. That part of the laws of dinim mominos that are not addressed by the Torah itself are found in Rebbe. Rebbe's din is recorded in a Brisa. Tisanya Rebbe Omer. Now we have to have a little bit of an introduction. In Parshas Mishpatim, there's a complicated scenario in which two men were fighting, and during the course of their boxing match, one of them actually hit a pregnant woman, and she lost her fetus, Nebuch. The Torah says the following: Lo yason anoshi anesh. If she survives, Baruch Hashem, then he has to pay damages. And there's a whole discussion about how much he has to compensate her, the Dmei Velados, and perhaps for her, he has to pay the 5 categories of Chovel, Nezek, Tzarib, Sheves, and Poshes. But then the Pasuk says, V'yamasonia, if on the other hand, never she dies, then V'nasata nefesh tachas nefesh, then the person who hit her will be put to death. So again, the pasuk is addressing two people that are fighting and struggling and hitting one another. One of them had kavana to hit his friend, but accidentally instead he hit the body of a pregnant woman. And if she survives and she loses the vlados, he has to pay what's called dmei vlados, which is also unto itself, how much exactly you assess the dmei vlados. But if she dies, then the Torah says, "V'nasato nefesh tachas nefesh." And Rebbe says, "Nefesh tachas nefesh, ata omer mamon, o eno elo nefesh mamish." Perhaps we should interpret this pasuk literally, straightforward. Rabbi Rhodes, are you there? I don't see you. Okay, maybe he's not. Oh, there he is. Okay, I chapped a little chalish sadas because I saw your name and not your wonderful face. So you might say that maybe we should actually put this man to death. But we'll see soon that in the case of a horeg or otzeach b'mezid, he has to have kavana to kill the person that he killed. He had no intention to take the life of this pregnant woman. But nevertheless, the Torah says, nefesh tachas nefesh. Nemer nesina lamato, v'nemer nesina lamala. And now we're going to use a kind of Gzeirah Shavah. It's not exactly Gzeirah Shavah, but similar to Gzeirah Shavah. In order to prove that we don't take this pasuk literally and condemn the horeg to death because of the word nesina. The Torah says, as we saw immediately before, v'nasata nefesh tachas nefesh. And lamala, at the beginning, the Torah says, with regard to a woman who lost her fetus nebuch because of the smack that she got, it says v'nasan biplilim. So again, the word v'nasan, mala halon, in the case of a man who is responsible for the destruction of the vlados, is mammon, he has to pay. Afkan, so too here, with she nebuch died, he has to pay mammon. And this is derived from Torah Shemal Peh. This is not explicit in the Torah. On the contrary, the impression you walk away with when you read the Torah Nefesh Tachas Nefesh is that we will take his life. But that's not true at all. So when the Mishnah says about dinim that it's only a remez muad, but it's not explicit in the Torah, we have drashas that we could be samech on. The Mishnah had in mind this halacha of Rebbe, that if he destroys the life of this pregnant woman, which he had no intention to do, he's not going to be put to death. And don't take the Torah Shabbat literally as nefesh tachas nefesh, but rather through nesina, we're going to derive the conclusion that he pays mammon. Avodos. The Mishnah continues and classifies the avodah, the karbanos, that we could be somech on drashos, but it's not explicit in the Torah. It's eino mefurish b'Torah sheb'chsav. It's the chachamim that will interpret the pasuk, and they will rule on the law based on their interpretation, based on their medrash. The medrash is reliable, but it's not explicit in the Torah. But once again, the Gemara raises the same objection. Michtav ksima. We have half a Sefer Vayikra addresses the avodah, the karbanos. What are you telling me that it's not? It's a little bit better than a Rebbe's muad, but it's drashos. Forget about drashos. It's in the Torah. Lo nitzcha ela lo lochas adam. The Gemara says that most of the avodas hakarbanos, the large preponderant majority, are explicitly addressed in the Torah Shabbat. But there's nothing in the Torah Shabbat about holochas adam. Right? There are four avodos. There's shchita, kabbalah, holacha, and zrika. Holacha is really just a technicality. And theoretically, you could even circumvent and drop halacha. Let's say, for example, he shechted the carbon right next to the mizbeach, contiguous to the mizbeach. He would not need any halacha He'd be makabel dam after shchita and immediately do the zrika. But in event that he does holacha, let's say where the shchita was at a distance from the mizbeach, then the laws of avoda apply to holacha. Holacha is now classified as one of the avodos, having the same status as shchita, kabbalah, and zrika. The Sanya we learned in a brisa. Now this brisa is analyzing the pasuk at the very beginning of Sefer Vayikra. It says, "V'shachat es ben abakar lefnei Hashem, v'krivu b'nei Aaron hakohanim es Adam, v'zarku es Adam al hamizbeach." What does the word v'krivu mean? And they will bring close. The b'nei Aaron hakohanim will bring close the dam, and then the pasuk says they do the zrika. V'krivu zu kabbalas hadam. We thought that the word vikrivu means to bring the dam closer to the mizbech, which is what we call holacha. No, the Brisa interprets the word vikrivu as referring to kabbalas hadam, meaning right after shchita, he has a vessel. It's called a mizrach, and he receives the dam in the mizrach. So the Gemara adds to this brisa, are you telling me that kabbalas hadam is written in this pasuk? Afka rachmana b'lashon halacha. The Torah doesn't use the terminology kabbalas hadam. On the contrary, the Torah uses the terminology of halacha, v'krivu. V'krivu means bring the dam close to the mizbeach. That's called halacha. And I'll prove it to you. The pasuk says, with regard to hakravas evarim of carbon ola, it says v'kerev ha'klayim yirchatz pamayim v'kriv ha'kohen hasakol v'ktir ha'mizbecha. And again, the word v'kriv ha'kohen, and then he brings it to the mizbech and he burns it on the mizbech v'yomar mar. And we have a statement with regard to this pasuk holachas evarim lakevish, that the word v'hikriv means to take the evarim and bring them close to the ramp, and then climb the ramp and put the Evarim and the P'darim and the Halavim onto the Mizbeach HaKtorah. So we see clearly that the word Vehikriv is used by the Torah in the meaning of halacha. And it's not referring to dam, to kabbalas hadam, but rather to halachas hadam. So the Gemara says, Lememra halacha lo tafka michlal kabbalah. Why did the Torah use the term halacha v'krivu when it's referring to kabbalas hadam? The answer is because the Torah wants to set up an equation, an analogy between kabbalas hadam and halachas hadam. Just like kabbalas hadam is considered an avoda, so too halachas hadam is considered an avoda. And my friends, this has tremendous repercussions, because if a non-Kohen could do the halacha, he would be chayev for violating a lav. And if, for example, during the halacha there was a machshav of shalol lishma, it would be mafagel the carbon, and so forth and so on. So we've upgraded the status of halachas hadam to be equal to kabbalas hadam with the full-fledged halacha and category of avoda. The Mishnah continues. Taharos, the laws of becoming tar, if you're tameh, you can rely on the drashas of Chazal, and it's more than just a remez muad, but it's not addressed explicitly in the Torah. Once again, the Gemara raised the same objection. Michtav ksiva. In fact, the laws of Tara and how to be matar yourself are written in the Torah. And where do we find them in the Torah? We'll soon see the laws of Tara in the Torah. But why do you tell me that it's not in the Torah? More answers, although the Torah tells you that a tummy should be tovel in a mikvah, so that's explicit in the Torah. But what is a mikvah? How much water does a mikvah have to contain in order to qualify as a kosher mikvah, so that a tummy can be tovel and become tar? And we know that that's 40 sah, but that's not written in the Torah anywhere. The word mikveh itself means an asifa, a collection of mayim. But how much water has to be there in order to qualify with the minimum amount of water necessary as a mikveh? And that's something that's derived in Torah Shebal Peh, not in Torah Shebetzah. Beside you, we learned in a brisa with regard to Taras Bal Keri in Perek Tesvav of Sefer Vayikra. The Torah says, "Ish ki seitzei mimenu shifazora v'rachatz es b'saro b'mayim," meaning he has to be tovel in mayim. And the word b'mayim is written with a pasach under the base, b'mayim. It doesn't say v'rachatz es b'saro b'mayim, but rather b'mayim. And that means b'mayim is like with a hey hayidiyah, special waters. Not any water, just wash yourself in a shower. No, the main mikvah. It's got to be rainwater that was collected in a certain area, a certain place, and that asifa is called a mikvah. But let's say you draw water through a kli, through a vessel, right? You pump water or you put it into the drains and then it goes through the pipes and it comes through on top of your shower. That doesn't qualify as a mikvah. The brisa then continues and says, as kol b'saro, that he has to submerge his whole body into the mikvah, and the mayim of the mikvah has to have a volume that is roy l'kol gufa, that there's enough water that the average person could dip his entire body into this mikvah of water. And ola bahen, and he will be covered by the water. And then he'll come up for the mikvah, and he's taught. So the word kol indicates kol gufa. V'kamahem. So for the average person, how much water do you need in this mikvah, in this cistern of water, such that we can guarantee that es kol b'sara, kol gufa ole bahen? And the answer is amal amma barum shalosh amos. We need the width of an amma, the length of an amma, and the height of 3 amos. It's interesting because an amma in American measurements would be approximately 2 feet, 24 inches. And shalosh amos would be 6 feet. So I'm wondering if the Gemara thought that the average person was 6 feet tall. He says, Eluhein midotzav shel adam beinani. The afal gav de rochav gufanum, the width of a person is pachos mi'ama, unless you're talking about somebody who's very obese. And don't add the clothing because he's going naked into the mikveh. He's not wearing any clothing. He says, "Mikol makom amru shemikvah royal tefillas adam beinani rocho am mikevin shetzarch sheyev mikvah rochav bi'at yotzi rochav shalatovabo kidei sheyuchal likanes litbo b'li dochak." So we give him a little extra space in the width, so he could go into the mikveh without feeling as if he's he's being squished. Ubegovo shel adam beinani. This is just the body, the torso, not the head. So again, I get the impression they were tall fellas in those days. I don't know if you ever heard of a yeshiva called Chaim Berlin in Brooklyn. No? Okay, that's not expecting you're not from Flatbush in Brooklyn, but they used to say about a Chaim Berliner that he's got to be 6 feet tall to learn in that yeshiva. All the guys there were very tall. In any event, he says that forget about the head, because as far as the head is concerned, he can bend his head down. So he needs shalosh amos to cover the height of his torso, even without the head. And this is what our Mishnah means when it classifies taros, meaning the process by which you become tar, as something that you could be somech on a medrash, but it's not exclusive in the Torah. The Torah says, "Me mikvah es kol besaro," and from es besaro, kol besaro, we derive the shiur of water in the mikvah. Then the Mishnah says tumos, and once again, tumos, you could be somech on the pasuk, and it's more than just a remez, but it's not explicit in the Torah. So the Gemara asks Sivan. After all, there's plenty in the Torah about tumos. That's the other half of Sefer Vayikra. It's about tumos. Lo nitzracha ella li, and here we have to add two words: tumas shrotzen. And what is the size of a sheretz? And the answer is, if it's a full sheretz, nothing was cut away from it. It's in its natural, normal size as it was born in this world, then it's metami. But if it's not shalem, then kadasha min sheretz. Even if you have only a lentil size of the sheretz, that's enough to be metami delok siva. And that's not in the pasuk. The Sanya we learned in a brayso, the Torah says in Vayikra Yud Aleph, Eilat meim lachem b'chol hasheretz kol hanogeh b'hem b'mosam yitmada orev. And what does the pasuk mean when it says b'hem? Yachol, I might think that only if a person comes in contact with bekulon, with all the shrots. What does it mean? All the shrots. I mean all of one whole sheretz. It's got to be a sheretz shalem, in which no part was cut out. Talmud Lomar, the Torah is going to tell me when it says Kol Asher Yipol Olav Mayhem. Mayhem means from them, Miktsas Mayhem, even if the sheretz is not complete, Kederch Briyasa, but it has a shear of Kadasha. Yachol B'Miktsasan. I might think that from the word mayhem, all you need is a small amount of the sheretz. Talmud Lomer Bahem. And Bahem seems to imply that it's got to be shalem. Okay, so how do we reconcile the two psukim of Bahem, and which implies Bekulon, and Mayhem, which implies any fraction, any segment of the sheretz? You've got to have part of the sheretz that's considered like the entire sheretz. So what's that? Why kadasha? Why the size of this lentil bean? Shekain chomet. Okay, there's a sheretz called a chomet. In modern Hebrew, it's called a shavlu. Is tchilaso, when it's born in its natural state with it before you cut it up, it's kadasha. And since it's one of the trotzim that is listed in the Torah, we know that even a kadasa is enough to be metame. It's mixas sheretz begodol kadasha, and it's metame. If it's pachos mekadash, it's lo nitma. Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yudomer, the shear of miksaso kikulo, which is metame, is kiznav halta'a. We have a halta'a, which is a lizard, and if you cut into the lizard, it starts jumping around. That's called mefarkes. And even after you literally cut the goof of this halta'a, it still jumps around. That's called mefarkes. And it has its own chiyus. It has its own life, so to speak. It's like a sheretz because it's nav halta. And an ogeb mixes sheretz begodol kiznav halta nitma. So it means that it's not enough that it has a kadasha. It's got to be the size of znav halta. So this is what the Mishnah means when it says that the laws of tumos, you can rely on a drasha, and we're talking about the shir of a sheretz latame. It's not explicit in the Torah, but rather it's derived from a drasha, and the drasha is either from chomet or from znav halta. The Mishnah goes on and says, "Arayos, the laws of forbidden relations are not explicit in the Torah." So Gemara asks, "Mitzav Ksivan, we have full parshas in the Torah. Achremos is all full of enumerating the lists of arayos. Lo nitzracha." And here we're going to turn to Daf Yud Aleph Amid Beis. Libito me anusaso. A man is the father of a girl who was not born to him within the framework of marriage. He raped a woman, and a daughter was born from that rape relation. The Torah doesn't say that. Nowhere does the Torah indicate that a bas anusaso is included under arayos. So it's not explicit in the Torah. We derive from Drashas Chachamim. And that's what our Mishnah had in mind. So the Gemara explains the drasha from which we derive the Yisur Erev and Bito Me'anusaso. And the Torah says in Parshas Akrimos, Ervas Isha Ubita Lo Segale, Es Bas Bina, Ves Bas Bita, Lo Sikach Legalos Ervasa, Shara Hena Zima Hi. So this pasuk teaches us that a man is not allowed to have relations with the daughter of his wife if she's married to him, what's called an asua. Also, he's not allowed to have a relationship with her granddaughter or with her granddaughter through a son. So once you get married, you are prohibited and joined from any of the relatives of your wife. They're not your relatives, they're your wife's relatives. And that includes Bita, Bas Bina. Now in another pasuk it says, Ervas Bas Bincha or Bas Bitcha lo segale ervasanki ervascha heina. And this pasuk teaches me the Isur Bia in his own biological granddaughter, which means either the daughter of his son or the daughter of his daughter. And it tells you that even if this is a Bas Anusaso, nevertheless, that's also included in the Erev. She's also Bito. The Omar Rava, Amali Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Avdimi, Asya Heina Heina. We're going to derive the Isur of Bito Me'anusaso from a Gzeirat Shav of Heina Heina. In the first pasuk that talks about an Asur, it says She'era Heina. In the next pasuk, which talks about an Anusa, it says Ke'ervascha Heina. And therefore, those two psukim, both of which have the word Heina, we're going to derive by analogy through Gzeiras Shava, one to the other, that just like in the case of Nesua, the Torah prohibited Bita, like Bas Bita and Bas Bina, so to an Anusa, Bito Asura, all of Kamo Bas Bito, Bas Bina. And as far as the punishment is concerned, Asya Zima Zima. We have the punishment of Sreifa, and that's derived from Gzeiras Shava, Zima Zima. In the first pasuk that talks about Nesua, it says Zima He. Let's see the pasuk again inside. Ervas Isho Bitol Segali, etc., Zima He. And the second pasuk, which is referring to an Anusa, the Bas Anusaso, that's based on the Gzeiras Shava of Heina Heina, which we discussed earlier. So the word Zima in this pasuk, in the second pasuk, is an Isur Chamoso. It says, "V'ish asher yikach es isha v'esima zima hi ba'esh yisrufu oso v'yesen." So in these two psukim, Anusaso and Chamoso, the Torah used the word Zima to teach me in Gzeiras Shava that just like the Chamoso, the onesh for having a relationship with one's mother-in-law is Sreifa. So too, if a person violates the Iser Erev of Bito Me'anusaso, he's Chayev Sreifa. And that's what the Mishnah meant to say, that Arayas is Yesh al Mashi Yismachu Midrash, but it's not Mefurish in the Pasuk. To teach us that Bas Anusaso is Chayev Sreifa. The Mishnah says about Dinim Momenos and Avodos, Karbonos, Darkitaris, Daritumas, Yisraelis, they're not explicit in the Torah, they're interpreted by the Chachamim, and nevertheless we can rely on their drashos, Hein Gufei HaTorah. And they have the same upgraded status as if they were written in the Torah. So the Gemara asks the following deal. When you say Hein Gufei HaTorah, these are Gufei HaTorah. Hani in Hanach Lo. What about all the dinim that are written in the beginning of the Mishnah? They're not so explicit in the Ksuvim, in the Psukim. And therefore, we're not going to consider them as Ikrei HaTorah. That can't be right. That must not be the pshat in the Mishnah, what the Mishnah has in mind, Ela Ema, but rather we should assume Hein Vehein Gufei HaTorah. It means whatever we derive from a drasha and whatever is written in the Torah with the Remez Ma'at, it's all Gufei Torah, and Ein L'chol Harherach Re'am, you shouldn't even have doubts about it. Hadran Alecha Kol Chayom. Now we start the second parak of Chagigah Mirz Hashem, parak Ein Darshim, which is addressing three different issues. First of all, we have an extension of what we learned before about Dini Arayos and how much we derive from the Psukim in Torah. Then we'll have the Mishnayos that review some of the laws of Korban Chagigah and other Karbonos as far as Smicha and Zvicha. Then we'll finally have the last Mishnayos in this parak, which address Tara that is necessary for Avodas HaKarbonos. The Mishnah says, Ein darshin bi'arayos b'shlosha. In other words, when the Rav is teaching the laws of arayos to a chabura, then he should teach it to a chabura of two people, which basically means he should teach it privately, like a tutor, just the Rebbe and the Talmud. V'lo b'maisa breishis. The understanding of the wisdom of nature and all the analyses and the dissections of what was created at the time of Breishis. Vishnayim, once again, that's a Rav teaching a Talmud one-on-one. V'lo b'maaseh merkava b'yochid. Now the Mishnah says that with regard to Maaseh Merkava, which is all about the essence of God, his descriptions, his existence in this world, all of that which is addressed by Yechezkel HaNavi, is this biyachid. You can only study it on your own. You can't even teach it to a Talmud. Elim Kain, Haya Chacham, if we're addressing that Yachid who's a Chacham, Umevin Midaito, so he's come to conclusions on his own, he doesn't require anyone to explain to him the psukim of Maaseh Breishis, etc. He's allowed to study and he's allowed to come to conclusions on his own, based on his own analysis, and then he's allowed to teach it, even if it's so halig, it's so high up, it's so abstract, it's like Maaseh Merkava, Maaseh Breishis, it's allowed to teach. Kol mistakel bi'arba dvarim li'olam, kol mistakel bi'arba dvarim rasui lo. He has a girsa roilo ki ilu lo ba liolam. There are four areas of thought that are out of bounds. They're not royal. One is ma lemala mimenu. In other words, what's up in the rakia? On top of the Roshei HaChayos, there were Chayos of the vision of Yechezkel. And you're not allowed to look and gaze lemala me'arakia. Ma lemata min haaretz is something that's covered by the globe, the land, mass. And that too should be left out from the process of transmitting Torah. Uma lifnim, uma liachar. What is on the other side of the rakia? You're contemplating infinity now. And mayesh lachar, you're going back in time. All that has to be, if you study it on your own, that's one thing, but not to teach it and transmit it. If a person doesn't have rachmanis on the honor and glory of his maker, rasuilo or roilo shalo boliolam, it would have been better had he not come to this earth. So the Gemara says, Amrit Bereisha. At the beginning it says, a darshan v'lo b'merkava b'yachid. A person is not allowed to involve himself in Maisa Merkava, even b'yachid, even levada. And once he starts learning it b'yachidus on his own, below my b'yachidi, and he doesn't hear it from his Rav, his Malamed, then although he shouldn't have done such a thing, but definitely he's a chacham, he's a maven mi'atzmo, elam kena yachacham u'meven midato. If a yachid could learn alone and successfully understand the Maisa Merkava, he doesn't have to ask any shelas chacham for guidance, mutal lasok, because then he's allowed to study this very esoteric discipline in Torah. So let's just see what goes on here. The Reisha says, "V'lo b'merkava b'yachid." An individual is not allowed to study merkava. Here it says, "V'za chacham mevin daito," midaito, then he could teach it to others. How do we reconcile this? Hachikama. This is what Gemara wants to reconcile. Ein darshin be'arayos lishlosha. In other words, it's just going to be the Rav and his student. Below the Ma'aser Bereishis l'shnayim. And when it comes to Ma'aser Bereishis, he should not be teaching two Talmidim. So it means for Arayos, he can teach it to two Talmidim. But Ma'aser Bereishis, he's not allowed to teach Ma'aser Bereishis to two Talmidim. It's too dangerous of a study. And the Rav should not even be teaching one single Talmud, b'yechidus, Ma'aser Merkava, elam kein haya chacham u'mevin midato. It means that the Rav could discern and determine that this student is a chacham. And if he gives him Rashi Prakim, and that's what he transmits him, just the general guidelines and the outlines, then the rest he'll figure out on his own. But if he's not a Talmud Chacham who understands Midaito, then we should not teach him Ma'aser Merkava. We should be Choshe, should be afraid. Maybe he'll have Spekos, he'll have to ask his Rav and Talmud, and they'll hopefully explain it to him and set him straight. And we conclude with Ein Zed Derech Eretz Chapimala Lefarich Tforim Elu. The Mishnah says, Ein Dorch Barais B'Shlosha My Taima Ilema Ish Mishum Dechsiv Ish Es Kol She'er B'Sara Lo Sikruvu Legalos Erva. We're going to dash an Ish Trey. These are two people. U'She'er B'Saro Chad. There's another individual who is a Sher Basar. He's related. So we have here three different people. The Amar Achmana, and the Torah commands Lo Sikravu Legalos Erev. So we can darshan it as if it says you shouldn't come close, because if all three people come close to an erva, which would mean that you had three Talmidim learning at the feet of one single Rebbe, then that could lead to the wrong kinds of thoughts and so forth. So now you'll ask Elameatu that Siv Ish Ki Kalel Elohav V'Nasach Et O. And that's a pasuk of Vayikra Chav Tal. Let's fast forward. Let's backtrack, rewind to Vayikra Chav, and there it says Ish Asher Yitem Mizarola Molech Mosyumas is Hachinami. It's a rhetorical question. Should we darshan that you're not allowed to teach dinim to two people? Elo hanu miboile. The words ish and these psukim are coming to Rabos es hanochrim shemuzharim al birchas Hashem ve'al avodah zarah ki Yisrael. Then amongst the 7 mitzvahs b'nei Noach, we should include birchas Hashem, which means Hashem cursing God's name, and the Isra avodah zarah. Is Hainami, this pasuk ish in the parasha of Arayos, we should say mi boile le rabos sad nochrim shemuzharim al Arayos b'Yisrael. It's again a ribui to include nochrim, non-Jews, in the Isra Arayos ki Yisrael. And if that be the case, we cannot derive from him that you're not allowed to teach Arayos b'Shlosha. Ella. But rather, the Isser of teaching Arayos to Shlosha Noshim is derived from the Chsiv in the Parsha of Arayos Vayikra Yiches Ushmartem es Mishparti. And twice in the same pasuk, Ushmartem. Why is it written in the plural, Trey? Mishmarti is Chad. So all told, we have 3 people. And regarding these 3 people, these 3 men, it says, Omakra, Livilti asos michukos hatoevos. We should not learn chukos toevos. And in the Dini Arayos that are mentioned in the Parsha, it's Bishlosha Noshim, because it says, Ushmartem b'loshen Rabim, Ushmarti b'loshen Yoch. Elameatu dechsiv Ushmartem es Hashavos, Ushmartem es Hamatzos, Ushmartem es Mishmeres Hakodesh Hachinami. Are we going to say that you're not allowed to darshan in front of 2 people in the areas of Shabbos and Matzos? Elomar of Ashi, my ain't dorsha barais b'shlosha, ain't dorsha b'sisrei arayos l'shlosha. The Rav is not allowed to darshan the 3 Talmidim the secret, hidden laws of arayos, which are not written in the Torah explicitly. But rather, Chacham derives from a drush in the psukim. But Shar Dini Arayas Hamafurashim, that which is explicit in the Torah, is Mutal Alamed Afli Yosef Ishlosh. My timer. What's the reasoning behind the Isa to teach Sisrei Arayos to Shlosha? Svarahu. Beitrei Kiyasvi Kami Rabayu, two Talmidim that are sitting next to their Rebbe at the feet of the Rebbe Chad Shakal V'Tari. One is involved with Shakal V'Tari Bahadi Rabbi. He's Nosei Notain with his Rebbe and Halacha. V'Idach, and the other one is Matzle Udnei L'Gemara. He inclines his ear for the study of Torah, of Gemara. So Shneim Shomim es Divrei Harav, but neither of them will come to a michshel, to be matir Isur Arayos. But the Gemara now asks, Lasa, let's say there are 3 Talmidei Chacham that are studying in front of the Rav. Is Chad Shokel Vitrei Bahadi Rabbe. One of them is involved in Masu Matan with his Rebbe in the laws that we're studying. Vahanach Trey Shaklu Vitori Bahadi Adodi. And the other 2 are involved in a Masu Matan between them in Divrei Halacha. V'lo Yadi Mai Kamer Abayu. They won't even pay attention and hear and understand what the Rebbe is teaching them at that time. The Asul of Misha Isur Barayas. They might come to be matir an Isur of Arayas, which is not explicit in the Torah because they didn't hear it from their Rav when he taught this Isur. Gemara says of Yechoshesh that maybe if the Rav is teaching 3 Talmidim or more, one is listening and the others are involved in Masuk Matan, they're being they're pilpulizing, and they might be Matur Isur because they didn't hear the Rebbe, is called Torah Nami. We should apply this to the entire Torah. Whatever you're studying. And we should prohibit and disqualify learning with three students. Why do you say it's a separate din in Arayos? And the Gemara answers Arayos Shani, the Amar Mar, Gezel Varayos, Nafsho, Shal Adam, Mecham Desan, Umis'av Elohim. The Chachamim were worried lest the Talmidim will not hear the drush of the Rav when he presents all the Surya Erva, because Arayos Nafsho Shal Adam Machmadasan, Mecham Desan. So if the Talmidim come to some sort of suffix with regard to these dinim, they're not going to be medagdik heitev. They'll be matir Isur erva if it's not written explicitly in the Torah and it's only darshan from the pasuk. Therefore, we're not going to allow darshaning to anything more than 2 students, because if after the Masu Matan with the Rav and Hilchas Arayas, whatever halachas they're learning, Hasheni Yita Ozno B'Akshiv, he's going to start listening the other one, and the Ikar Davar Shamar Belev Shnayim. Ihachi Gezel Nami, also within the framework of the laws of Gezel, it should be also to teach 3 people, because Nefesh Chamdasan, that's what we just said. So we should be Choshesh, made in the Talmidim, we're not going to listen carefully to what the Rebbe says, and they'll be Matir when Isur Gezel. Where answers Arayos, maybe B'fana Ben Shalom B'fana. Nafish Yitzrei. He's always facing the challenges of the Yetzer Hara, which is mafata him, and tries to convince him that he should be matir for himself and Ereva. And therefore, even during the time of learning, when he's studying the Inyonim Varayos, and it's Ein Avera Lefanav, we're afraid that maybe Yitzro, his Yetzer, will be mafata him, will seduce him to be matir the Isur. The Gezel B'fanav, if he sees it right in front of his eyes, Nafish Yitzrei, his Yetzer is Meruba and is seducing him to steal. But in the case of Shalom B'fanav, if he doesn't see him, his low Nafish Yitzrei, his Yetzer is not so powerful, and therefore even when he's learning with the Talmidim Dinei Gezel, is lo chasheshu sheyavo lahatir sa'isur im yisu v'yitnu bazeh v'atzman v'lo yichvu es divrei harav yosef shah. We're not afraid that, they're so involved in pilpul, they won't listen to the Rav, and they might come to be matir and Isur based on their masumat bi'atzma, what they do privately. They're not going to be interested in listening to the Rav at that time. So lo chashashu, because ein yitzor meruba, and therefore nitain lilame din gezel l'shlosha talmidim o yoser. You're allowed to teach the laws of gezel to 3 talmidim or more, and we're not choshesh.
Rabbi Birdsong, is this Daf Yomi or?
This is Daf Yomi, and we just finished the Daf Yomi, and now we're going to look for the link.
Okay.
Which link?
935.
935 link. Okay, then?
I'll come on that.
And Rabbi Rhodes, I have to reschedule for tomorrow. Well, I'll ask you what your availability is, because tomorrow I have a shiur at 8:30 here that I have to give. Okay. We'll talk about it.